Take a look at this image. It looks a little dark, right? So let's add a little bit of Lightroom and Photoshop magic and see where we can take it. That looks pretty good to me. The technique I just showed you guys is what's known as underexposing. Now, underexposing doesn't mean that you should shoot at weird settings just to get your image darker than you could, but rather the technique actually lies in aiming to expose for the highlights of the photo rather than just the main subject itself. Then later in post, bringing back the shadows and controlling those highlights to effectively have a well-balanced photo. Underexposing is possible because of the advancement of camera technology in terms of dynamic range, which is basically the range between the darkest part and the lightest part of your image. Most modern cameras today have between 12 to 14 exposure values, or EVs, of dynamic range, which means the brightest parts of your image, or the highlights, can be brought down, while the darkest parts of your images, or shadows, can be brought back up. Back in the early digital days, when shadows would be brought back up by a stop or two, this would introduce a lot of undesirable noise. But as sensor technology has developed, we've seen cleaner and cleaner shadows, which allows us as photographers more leeway in exposing just the way we want. This leads to the idea of exposing for the highlights. When your subject is backlit or surrounding light sources are typically brighter than your subject, underexposing comes in handy to make sure as much of your image has data you can use. If we were to expose for the subject, this would make the brighter parts of the image too bright that we wouldn't be able to salvage those parts anymore. But if we were to expose for the brighter parts, it's a lot easier to bring up shadows and balance your image in post. There's also the concept of ISO invariance, where some cameras have sensors that are ISO invariant, meaning you can raise exposure in post without having a lot of quality degradation. Now, of course, this is a very case-to-case thing because not every sensor is ISO invariant, so you need to do a bit of research on where your camera stands in terms of that. But the main idea here is that ISO invariant cameras will allow you to underexpose better and have cleaner images using this method. If you want to learn a bit more about ISO invariance, Peter Zelinka has an amazing article and video all about it, which is linked in the description of this video. Other benefits of underexposing include being able to use lower ISOs. Typically, when underexposing, you would use ISO as your control. The benefit of doing this is that at lower ISOs, you get cleaner images with less noise. But does this mean that you should shoot at ISO 100 and call it a day? Nope, not at all. Knowing your camera is the first step to mastering this technique. Usually when underexposing, you go around 2/3 to 1.5 stops under, so if your meter tells you that middle exposure is using ISO 1600, then aim for around ISO 1000 to underexpose. Some cameras can be pushed further than others, so know your gear and test it out. Underexposing is also useful for compensating for other settings. Sometimes you'd be starved for light but need to shoot at a fast shutter speed. One of the examples I've experienced is at sporting events where lights are usually pretty bad. By underexposing, you allow yourself to use the correct shutter speed to freeze the motion, but use cleaner ISOs so that your photos still come out crisp and sharp. While cameras today generally have pretty good dynamic range, this technique works best if you're shooting in RAW. By shooting in RAW, you're able to take the data from your sensor and mold that into the final output you want via post-processing software such as Lightroom or Photoshop. But shooting underexposed isn't always the way to go. It's not a rule, it's a technique, and with any other technique, it has its time and place in your arsenal. Shooting underexposed isn't always beneficial in every scenario, and in fact can be harmful in certain scenarios. This is why a lot of people value the practice of getting it right straight out of the camera. The idea of getting the shot right straight out of camera is that it minimizes the work needed, if any at all, done in post. Some people aren't big fans of heavy edits. Adding some contrast, vibrance, and adjusting exposure is all they need to do to get the image they want. There's definitely value to getting it right in the camera. One of the contexts that I personally always try to get it right in the camera is at studio shoots, where I'm able to control all the lighting. Going back to the idea that underexposing is a technique used to balance out the highlights, it's usually used in contexts where you don't have full control over the lighting, so you have to really compensate and push your camera's capabilities. But in studio, however, where you do have control over the lighting, it's a lot easier to get it right in the camera by mastering your lighting techniques. To add to that, If you're working with a bigger team where the images need to be used immediately or feedback on the images is needed at the shoot itself, you definitely need to get it right in camera so you can give the rest of the team an idea of the work everyone is doing. So at the end of the day, what should you do? Should you underexpose or should you get it right in the camera? This really all depends on your context as a photographer and the areas you're comfortable in. If you're shooting for a client who needs the images ASAP, then get it right straight out of the camera and deliver on the job. If you're shooting in uncontrollable environments and the difference between getting the shot and not getting the shot at all is that your exposure is off, then go and get the shot. Bottom line, these practices are not rules. They are tools that you have under your belt, and if the context calls for one or the other, then use them accordingly. What matters more is your mastery of your gear, knowing the limitations and extents you can push your gear towards, your attitude towards each situation, and having the wisdom to know when and where to use certain techniques, and your creativity. Because at the end of it all, getting it right straight out of the camera and underexposing are just means to an end. Just because you do one or the other doesn't make you any more or any less of a creative. What defines you is what you do with these techniques and what you create with them. That's about it. Thank you for watching this video. If you're interested in learning more about underexposing, I'll link some resources you can watch and read in the description. If you found this video helpful, feel free to share it and subscribe for more videos like these. I'll see you guys next time.